Welcome back to Chess Games. So as you can probably tell by the title, the game I'm about to show you is definitely not my finest game. This game was played back in April 2019 at a pretty small tournament at a chess club affiliated with my school, Rutgers. Now, this game was played in the third and final round of the tournament, and in the previous round I had actually lost in a very close battle against a similarly high-rated player. And so going into this game, I was a bit tired, but I saw that I was up against the 1000, so I was kind of relaxed, thinking, okay, I'm not going to be able to win the tournament, but I can at least finish strong and finish with 2 points out of 3. But anytime you're going into a game underestimating your opponent could be a recipe for disaster. And so my opponent, who had only played a couple rated tournaments up to this point, opened with c4. And at the time, I really was not familiar with the English, so I just played c6, kind of turning it into a Slav, which is something I was more familiar with. And after knight f3, d5, e3, knight f6, d4, e6, knight c3, we have exactly that, a Slav. And after knight to d7, he played queen to c2. And after bishop e7, the common moves here are to take on d5 or to play bishop d3. But instead, he went for e4, very aggressive, going for an immediate opening of the center. But the drawback to this is that the d4 pawn is now no longer well protected and could be a liability in the future. So after this, I simply took, and after knight takes, I castled. And after bishop d3, I took the knight. And after bishop takes, it looks like he has a very powerful battery aim against h7, but I simply play knight f6, defending the pawn and hitting the bishop, forcing him to retreat. And now I played c5, and already black is almost equalized in this position because I'm now attacking the center. All I need to do is develop his bishop, and I'm going to have a pretty good position. And so he took, and after bishop takes, he castled. And here I played h6, just stopping him from playing bishop g5 and creating this pin. And he played rook to d1, which kind of attempts to be sneaky and threatens the move bishop h7. Like, for example, if I'm not careful and play b6, bishop to h7, and after knight takes, rook takes queen, and although black gets a rook and a bishop in return, white is much better here. But, of course, I saw this coming, and I simply played queen to c7, eyeing up maybe some kind of moves like knight to g4, maybe attack this pawn here, maybe b6 and bishop b7, and I felt like I was in control. And now he played the move queen to c3, which, on first glance, doesn't really look like it does anything, and me being in 1900 playing against someone that's below 1100, I really didn't take this move seriously, and I simply played the move rook to d8, which is already actually a big mistake because it completely misses white's threat. Now, what I should have played here is a simple move knight to g4, which now attacks this pawn, which has been neglected because of the rook being on d1. And in order to defend this, he would then have to play either rook to d2, which looks very awkward, blocking the bishop, or would have to retreat to f1, neither of which look very appealing, and then I can just continue with something like b6 and bishop b7, try to harass this knight, try to create some mating threats. Again, black is doing very well here. But instead I played kind of the aimless move rook to d8, and now here comes the move for white. Bishop takes h6. The point is that when the queen was moved to c3, it was putting pressure on the knight, which is something I failed to realize. And now the problem is if I take the bishop, queen takes knight. And not only did white win a pawn, but now my king is completely exposed, and the defenses around him have been entirely busted. And so after this move, I actually found a little bit of a trick just to not lose a pawn entirely by playing bishop takes f2. The idea is that after king takes, I have the move knight to g4, which creates a fork, and after king goes back, I'm able to pick up the bishop, and at least I got a pawn back, and I'm not doing so bad. But, of course, he's not forced to take the bishop, and so he simply played king to h1. And again, I'm faced with a problem. I can't take the bishop, or else he'll take the knight. And here, I'm already in a pretty uncomfortable spot, and I play the move knight to h5, which is, again, far from the best move. The idea is that it defends his g7 pawn from the attacks from the bishop and the queen, but it allows white a lot of opportunity, and my opponent could have just played bishop g5 and attacked the rook. He could have played the move queen to d2, hitting the bishop, and then threatening to maneuver the queen in here. Instead, he played the move rook to d2, which attacks my bishop, and now I decided to take his bishop, and after rook takes, we see that the material is equal, But again, this is not a very convincing structure around the black king. And so here, I have to be, again, very careful. My king is very unsafe. My opponent has a queen and a bishop that are pointing towards it. But, again, I played not such a good move. Knight to f4, which, I mean, it looks good because it's attacking the bishop twice. But simply, my opponent could have retreated back and then prepared to maneuver the queen into f6, and I would have been in a lot of trouble. Instead, he played the move knight to e5, which allows me to capture. And after knight captures, I should have really focused on my king's safety and played the move f5, which kind of blocks the rook out and prepares to maybe reinforce the king with some rook maneuvers, maybe a queen maneuver. But instead, I basically played for a trick by playing the move b5, which invites white to take, after which queen takes, pawn takes, and then I pick up the knight. But, of course, this isn't suicide chess. White does not have to take the pawn. And my opponent smartly played the move rook a to f1, now doubling up against the f-pawn, and I should have seen this coming. I scrambled to defend by playing f5 here, but now here comes c5. He rejects the capture and instead pushes this pawn. It's now a pass pawn, and it's going to close out my bishop. I played bishop to b7. Here my opponent played the move knight to e5, which looks quite good. It's putting the knight in a very central location, but it's at the same time, it's a missed opportunity because a much stronger move here would have been knight to f4, which hits this pawn and threatens to create a fork, but at the same time it threatens to maneuver the knight into a very attacking position, and in order to defend I would have had to play something like queen f7, but now c6 can be played, attacking the bishop, and after bishop moves, even c7. And again, this pawn is distracting everything from the defense of the king. He can now even crash through with the move knight takes e6, and after queen takes, rook takes, and my king is completely defenseless. With these rooks and bishop completely out of the game and unable to come back in time, I would be in a lot of trouble in this position. But instead, my opponent played knight to e5, which is still good, putting the knight in a central square and threatening c6. And I played rook to d5, attacking the knight, and so he pushed the pawn. And now I move the bishop, although, again, I really should have just taken the knight, because after queen takes, and if he takes on b7, I can simply play the move rook to b8, and he doesn't have any tricks with queen to c8 check, because my king can simply move off to h7, and my queen guards the rook on b8. And if you were to trade the queen, then I'm going to win this pawn the next move. So in this position, I could have just taken the knight, but instead I moved the bishop off to the way, which, again, allows him a lot of opportunities, and he correctly played knight to d7, which now threatens to maneuver the knight into f6 and fork my king and rook, and I simply cannot allow this. At this point, I realized I have to give up the exchange. So I played rook takes knight, and after pawn takes, queen takes. So after 27 moves, my position is very dire. If I was playing against a bit of a stronger opponent, I might not have made another 5 moves because my king is still so exposed, and my opponent has 2 rooks, which granted are not really in the game yet, but they can come in at any point with something like this. And in this position, actually, a very strong move would have been queen f6, because this now attacks the pawn, plants the queen in a very strong position, and next white can maneuver the rook in, and it's going to be very hard to defend against these threats. Instead, my opponent played the move b4, which looks good because it kind of closes the bishop out of the game, but at the same time, it gives me ample opportunities to get my king to a safer position. So I played king to h7, just getting the king out of the g-file, and now he played rook to d2, attacking my queen. I moved off to the side, and now he played the move rook after d1. Very nice move. Now doubling up the rooks, preparing to invade with rook to d7. And so I played rook to e8. And now in this position, my opponent actually missed a knockout blow. See if you can find it. The correct move here for white is the straightforward rook to d7, which creates an attack against the queen, which can't move because it's pinned to the king. But after rook to e7, the winning move here is queen to c7. This is very important because if the rook simply takes, the queen will take, and black kind of fended off the danger. But after queen to c7, black's pieces are simply overloaded. If rook takes rook, then rook takes, and the queen is getting lost because, again, it can't run due to the king's unsafe position. And there's really nothing else I can do. There's no way to defend the rook a second time, so either rook takes rook, and then the queen is getting lost, or black has to play king g6, and then rook takes rook. Instead, my opponent played the move queen to c6 here, which also looks good because it attacks the bishop, but now the bishop is able to retreat to b7, counterattacking the white queen. And after queen takes b5, now I'm able to play bishop d5, blockading against the two rooks. So although white has these doubled rooks, they're now no longer able to invade along the d-file. And so my opponent played rook to c2, now switching attention to the c-file, but now I play the move rook to g8. I'm down material, but at least I have a target, the g2 pawn, against which I know I can create some pressure. And here my opponent could have continued with something like rook d to c1, now threatening rook to c7, but he played the move queen to e2, which again is a mistake, but one that I failed to capitalize on. In this position I could have simply taken rook takes g2, and after queen takes, bishop takes, and rook takes, although it's a queen against two rooks, I very importantly have two connected pass pawns that I can now advance forward. But for some reason I didn't take the pawn, I played queen to g7, now adding another attacker against the pawn, but it's really not that effective because against my three attackers, white also has 1, 2, 3 defenders. And so the move that, again, should have been played is rook to c1, now threatening rook to c7. Instead, my opponent kind of panicked here and sacrificed his rook to get rid of that powerful bishop on d5, and after pawn takes, he now made a fatal error. In this position, the move that should have been played is something like h3, and this is kind of an equal position now. Both sides have 4 pawns, and my pawns are actually all completely disconnected, so that could be good for white to target. Instead, however, he played the immediate queen to f3, looking to fork these pawns, but there's one small downside to this move, and now see if you can find the move that punishes white's recklessness. And the move is, of course, queen to a1 check. White, in his eagerness to attack these two pawns, completely forgot about his back rank, and I was now able to come in with queen a1 check. And it was in this position that my opponent actually resigned, ruining the missed opportunities of almost beating a much stronger player. Of course, it just goes to show that even when you play really well, you always have to look out, and in this position, a simple back rank threat was the decisive factor in the game. But kudos to him, he actually played very well and really had me on my toes. I was almost sure at some points that I was about to lose to 1,000, and that would have been a really embarrassing moment in my chess career. But fortunately, I was resilient enough to continue to defend, even in a bad position, and got to an equal position and finally was able to land a knockout blow out of completely nowhere. So above all else, I think 2 things can be taken away from this game. Number 1, don't underestimate your opponents, even if they're much lower rated than you, because they might still know their stuff and cause you a lot of problems. And on the converse side, if you're playing against a stronger player, just play your stuff. They might underestimate you, and you might get a lot of good opportunities to win. But the game's not over until it's over, and you got to continue to fight those right moves if you want to bring the result home.